morning. Am I audible? Good. Today's subject is really the third in a series of lectures that began by focusing on Ralph Waldo Emerson and then extended into New England Transcendentalism and now finishes with American Transcendentalism, which is so much tied into the idea of international transcendentalism that the idea of naming it American is really just a means of narrowing the focus a little bit. By definition, transcendentalism these days is taken to mean an obscure philosophy that came out of German Romanticism and was completely ignored within 30 or 40 years of its inception and is now a curiosity to be studied. In the context of this lecture, we mean transcendentalism in the sense of any philosophy, any form of belief that leads one to contact with a higher sense of reality, that leads one to an understanding of internal principles, of integrity, and of a fitness in the greater context of the world. As such, transcendentalism is not a philosophy which arose in New England in a certain period of time, but is something that has been with humanity as far back as history goes, and further back into anthropological speculation with the ideas of shamanism and all sorts of tribal attempts to understand the meaning of life and to find a way to orient oneself into living a better kind of life. Now, the subject has been divided into three parts: the heritage, the promise, and the awakening. Most of the time will be spent on the idea of awakening. We'll begin with a little bit about heritage. I do direct you to the two earlier lectures which are available on tape, which will be much more factual than this one. America has a peculiar kind of transcendentalism that runs quietly underneath the surface of American history since the inception of the country. Many people today like to look back and say, well, America was founded in a kind of materialistic, capitalistic days of desire. Manifest destiny is conjured up as an image of the American sentiment. But in fact, that only represents one part of American spiritual orientation, this idea of freedom and of destiny. There's been another also, and that is the idea of freedom, the idea of being somehow God's country. This is all wound up with the feeling of oneness with nature. And perhaps the most paramount distinction of American philosophy and of American religion, as it is indigenous to this country, is this love of nature, is this awareness of the tremendous beauty of the country, of the rich resources of the country, and of the sense that this country and the beauty of it expresses divinity, the presence of some sort of a spiritual, supernal essence by contact with which the human being is able to improve their life. These days, most of us who are interested in these subjects turn to the East or to Europe. Most of our religions come out of the Judeo-Christian or the Asian cultures. We turn to Chinese philosophy. We turn to Hindu teachers. We look everywhere, forgetting that there is a very rich spiritual heritage here in America itself. And I am not referring to the spiritual heritage of the land, which in itself offers us endless potential for study and realization. To stand in Yosemite Park or in Yellowstone Park or before the Grand Canyon is to learn something about God and man. It is to realize a new relationship of awe to the universe and to wonder. But we also have an historical heritage, a heritage of teachers and of writers who very much expressed the beauty which they saw in this country, and who digested the teachings that came from other sources, and who then recast the teachings in an American mode, conditioned by the idea of destiny and responsibility and democracy. We can refer to these teachers and find profundities in every way comparable to those available in any other culture. We needn't look to India or to China or to Tibet for profundity. We have it here. It may do us good to compare between them and to realize that, in essence, the teachings are the same. But there is a peculiar distinction about the American heritage. And that is that America functions in the history of the world as a great experiment. America went against the predominant idea that racial purity, that national purity in some way led to excellence of culture and to excellence of thought. This was an idea that was very common in Europe and in the Orient throughout the history of man. America was an experiment in that in America there became combined many races and many creeds and religions and philosophies, many different experiences of culture. And in a very short amount of time, so short that it is startling in the greater context of history, America emerged as the preeminent power in the world, proving that the experiment was a success and proving that these ideas of purity were untrue and that the only actual relationship that needed to remain pure was that between human being and human being and nature, and human being and God. This distinction of American philosophy is something that has to be and should be translated to the rest of the world. As we get to the idea of awakening, we'll discuss this a little bit. It is surprising how little Americans know about their heritage of spiritual teachers. There are famous names, names that are to a certain extent known throughout the world, names that are famous here. To most of us, they are just names. There are other teachers who are completely forgotten, who were important perhaps 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and these days can only be found in moldering old books, but who also had quite brilliant teachings, and who in many ways function as the roots of individuals who now gain our respect, or individuals who stand out in history with special distinction. The Emersons, the Thoreaus, the Whitmans did not grow out of the soil magically. There was a long history, a very long history of spiritual searching and spiritual accomplishment that accompanied their development, much of which has been forgotten. The richness of this search is also unusual and in some sense peculiar to America, in that it has taken complete variety as its focus. There hasn't been one preeminent, say, theological focus which all the teachers of distinction accepted, or, say, a type of scholarship which above any other was distinct among American scholars. But there were all sorts of attempts. There were men going off meditating on mountains. There were women experimenting with psychic communications. There were scholars. There were naturalists. There were politicians, all searching in their own way and all reporting what they had found, leaving us a rich legacy of healers, of scholars, of historians, of psychics, all of whom report, in essence, the same truths, the same ideas about what it means to live well, what it means to have some relationship with greater realities, what it means to have responsibility to the human race. There's some question as to whether or not it is necessary to go plumbing through the depths of history to find these individuals. One could argue either direction. One could say that it is a terrible pity that their teachings be lost, and it would be so good if they could be made available to us again, and we could at least be familiar with the ground on which these men and women traveled, so that we would not mistake in the way they had mistaken, and we would perhaps be so much more advanced by standing on their shoulders. And yet one also wonders if perhaps they have sunk into obscurity because their task is finished, and ours now begins, and those who we need are here with us, and those materials which we require are also here with us. Now, we will move on to promise briefly. because it absolutely ties in with this idea of our having what we need here. Very seldomly do people consider that in this age, today, we have available to us more teachings from more periods of history and so many different ways that it is incomparable with any other period of history. If you wish to study Plato, you may go out to any bookstore on any corner and find a little paperback edition. If you wish to study the most sacred scriptures that have been translated out of Chinese and Sanskrit and Tibetan, they also are there in inexpensive paperback editions. All the great thoughts of history are available to us now. If we do not wish to read the originals, then we have summarized forms. We have teachers and scholars who are more than happy to present us with their digestion of these teachings, with their understandings of it, and their experience of what it means to practice what they have studied. All this is available to us. If we don't wish to read, then we have tapes. If we don't wish to have tapes, then we have lectures. We have television and film. We have teachers of every sort available to us to see. There are probably more Tibetan lamas and swamis here today than there are in Asia. But they are here and they are available. If one wishes to study Zen, one does not need to go to Japan. There is a Zen Roshi in Los Angeles who is quite respected. If one wishes to study Tibetan Buddhism, one needn't go to Tibet. There is a Tibetan priest in Los Angeles who is very much respected. So much is available to us. It is really only up to us to make use of the tremendous resources which have been given us. And in fact, these resources are increasing. It is amazing to see each year how much more of this material is made available. How many things which had never before been available in Western languages are being translated. How much material which has not been published in 100, 200, 300 years is now being republished and is available. How many more speakers are feeling an inner urge to reach out and to speak? How many more writers are writing about their experiences? Everything that we require for our spiritual development is here, including the most important thing of all, a tremendous challenge. In ancient Chinese ideographs, the ideograph which represents crisis also represents opportunity. And in fact, today we may stand at an ultimate crisis point in human development, at least in our history of human development. We also stand at an ultimate point of opportunity and see what support we are already given. See what is available to us, that we should have no complaint that we were not properly prepared to deal with the crisis. Everything that is necessary, any question that you might have that can be answered in a book may be answered there. And there are books enough for you to discover that you will not answer them in books. And then when you tire of that approach, there are other approaches to take. And there is more than enough pressure to turn you inwardly and to set you to the search for the teacher within you who truly has the answer to the crisis. Now, what do I mean by crisis? I could select several hair-raising crises to tell you all about and make us all very nervous. I won't. I'll briefly mention a couple because they may surprise you. The lack of imagination, which the world as a whole is suffering. The tremendous apathy, feeling of limitation, which has overcome so many of us. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Not too long ago, I had the privilege to be in Yosemite Park and to stand almost as close as to the front row from several deer. I saw 5 carloads of individuals drive by, flagged down by a ranger to slow down, look at our car, and not see a single deer, even though they were close enough to touch it. This is how unconscious these people were. This is how unconscious the cities, the cars, the striving for material possessions has made them. It's a very frightening and also a very sad thing to realize that people have become so blinded to the beauties that this country and this world offer. That is a danger. We live, so many of us, in our urban environments, and we forget what is offered us for our learning. Paracelsus, many years ago, said that if you wish to learn the book of nature, you must walk its pages with your feet. And nature is still available for us to walk through. We can still stand in awe before a waterfall or before a great mountain peak, and we can learn very much about ourselves and about the world. Because I tell you that all the vanity of studies, all the things which one learns, and all the beautiful, shiny facts fall very quickly in such an environment. And you are left with the incredible sensation of being and of beauty and of appreciation, and most importantly of all, the feeling of awe and the feeling of contentment with awe. Too seldomly do we today feel awe or wonder. We have become so lackadaisical about it. We decide, science has explained it. It isn't so wonderful. Men have walked on the moon. What's so special about that? There really is so little left to wonder about. Nature is a problem. What do we do with food? How do we keep a few parks for our pleasure so our children will have somewhere to go? We divide everything up into little political and scientific problems and ignore the reality of the awe. I have a pet theory that if one were to take the most rigid atheist and put them into such an environment, or even so much as put them into a truly beautiful Gothic cathedral and sit them there alone and let them feel the feelings. Now, they may not agree that this is God that they are feeling or that this is spirit, but they must agree that here is something that they feel for which reason fails them. They have no recourse but to accept and to simply be in awe. And this is to a great extent an American gift because of the tremendous beauty and variety of the nation, of the cultures that make up the nation, and of its possibility. America has, however, done a better job of transmitting the destiny-prone aspect of its spirituality, this idea of ruthless effort. And unfortunately, we are now seeing that this ruthless effort is not as functional as we thought it was. It certainly did accomplish what we had intended it to accomplish. We managed to consume the world, make of it what we wished, and now we don't like it. Now we don't like what we made of it. And so we think, must be another way to approach these things. We attempt to reason our way out of it. That doesn't work, and so we are wound up with a feeling of apathy, a feeling of, well, obviously there's nothing that can be done. Absolutely untrue. What can be done is that there can be a return to that tradition, to that heritage of spiritual understanding transmitted through spiritual teachings, the idea of service to one's fellow man, of service to the planet as a whole, to the cosmos. It is not even necessary that any theological conception be brought into it. One needn't discuss God. One needn't discuss the immortality of the soul. One need simply be aware that there are certain responsibilities to one's fellow human beings, and that there are certain ways to live life that make us happy, that make us feel good, that give satisfaction. And those are the things that must be cultivated. Those feelings, in their very giving of this satisfaction, of this feeling of peace, are demonstrating to us their tremendous importance in these times of unrest. The way is constantly shown to us. How then do we fall off it? We ignore it. we decide that it is absolutely impractical to behave in such a manner, even though we see around us the wages of impracticality, of centuries of impracticality, which we have been used to calling reasonable. Perhaps we do decide that this is the correct way to go, and we begin our walk on the path. Unfortunately, we tend to fasten on aspects of it. For instance, a piece of music or a particular religious teaching inspires in us a feeling of religious awe, and suddenly we are passionate lovers of music. We are passionate devotees of a spiritual teacher or religion, not realizing that the music and the religion are merely awakening aspects of ourselves that can be awakened by a myriad of different stimuli. Rather than thinking that it is the divinity within us that is being awakened, we think that there is something divine in this external, in this piece of music. And yet, must there not be something divine within us that responds to the divinity in the music or in the spiritual teaching? There's a wonderful phrase in one of the oldest of all Chinese books, the very first line of the Lao Tzu, which is usually translated as, "The way that can be spoken of is not the way." But actually, in Chinese, what is being said is, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the Tao. What does that mean? It's a very confusing little intellectual game, but it isn't actually. What it's saying is that if you can walk on that way, it is already not the way, because to know that you can walk on it, you must be looking ahead. You must already have decided this is the way to go. And the moment you do that, you're off the track. Absolute spontaneity, absolute consciousness is what we're striving after. We must be able to respond to all things. An interesting thing in Buddhism is that the word dharma is used to describe individual happenings, events, things, anything one cares to mention as a focus of thought or of attention. But the word dharma also refers to the teachings of the Buddha and the path that leads to enlightenment and to freedom from suffering. And what does that tell us? That the two words refer to these two terribly separate things. The things are not separate. That all these little dharmas are in themselves the way. That all these little events and persons and objects and anything that we can put our attention on is in some way a sermon to us, is in some way an example of the way. So that if we focus on one thing that gives us this feeling of satisfaction, of spiritual accomplishment, and we exclude everything else, because we feel that everything else is simply amazing of that one way, is simply a confusion around it, then we forget that that one way is simply showing us the potential of all the other ways. This is the realization which a minority are reaching today, and which has been passed down by a minority through the centuries of human development. We're going to touch on the idea now of the awakening. We'll go back to the other two now and then. What is meant by a spiritual awakening? Do we mean that there will be some advent of consciousness which will radically transform all of society? Do we mean that, as if by some descent of Holy Spirit, the world will be entirely changed without any need for human effort? We must examine that idea. We must think about our experience of life. Do we gain without effort? We do not. So what do we mean by spiritual awakening, if not some external saving power that will come upon us and open us? We mean that in this time of crisis and opportunity, there is a minority that is larger, perhaps, than it has ever been in written history, who are searching for answers and who understand the problems which the race as a whole faces. Let the majority protect what there is to protect. This is part of the normal function of the race and is good. But let the minority seek to become practitioners of evolution. Let them seek ways of developing their consciousness and understanding. Let them cease from theorizing. Let them begin to practice and to experience and to report. Let them push out the edges of human possibility. Earlier in describing the idea of crisis, was mentioned a terrible lack of imagination. Now, why should that be seen as a crisis? True, perhaps in some ways the art and music of the time might be disappointing, but we could argue aesthetically that it is not. And even if it were, is that really so bad? Is that what we mean by imagination? Not at all. What we mean by a lack of imagination and the danger of it is that these tremendous problems we face, these problems of nuclear annihilation, of political chaos, of frustration and mass apathy, are our own creations. We have invented them. And it is only because we have an insufficient strength of imagination to solve them that we are so faced and cowed by them. Rather than facing them and rather than being electrified by the challenge and feeling that now indeed we have no choice but to accomplish and to search and to seek and to enjoy the searching, we fall into a numbness and into a sleep, and we wish to avoid. There is no answer in avoidance. There is no answer in numbness. There is an answer in facing a situation. Any of the chaotic situations that we face today are faced by each one of us as individuals in our lives, irregardless of what is happening to the whole. Death faces each of us. Political chaos, social chaos faces each of us in our own ways. What we are seeing is only a projection of what every human being faces, projected into a gigantic shape. And it frightens us. But why does it frighten us? Because it reflects something about ourselves. Because we must see our own fears in the mirror of that crisis. And we must see the denial of our opportunities in the mirror of that crisis. Now, I speak here of a minority of individuals because it is my belief that anyone who is already in this auditorium and is already associated with these teachings is such a person and has such potential. I would argue that any human being has that potential. But I will especially argue that those who are already in touch with these teachings and who are interested and motivated by them, that these have a special responsibility, not only to themselves, but to the entirety of mankind in this period of crisis. Each of us becomes a pioneer. Each of us must rediscover an original connection with reality, not with mental reality, but with spiritual reality. Each of us must dig our way through and find a truth about ourselves and about the world, because each of us represents such a truth. It's only necessary that one have the desire to search, the commitment, few moments. It's all that it requires to begin perhaps the most massive and most glorious effort in human history, against certainly the most astounding odds. But there is no question of success when such an effort is undertaken. Just as in the history of mankind, there is no question but success when we read of individuals who have been faced by these kinds of chaos, by fears of death, by all the nightmares that can possibly be conjured by human intellect and emotions. They begin the search and they find, and they have peace. They learn, they report. They are so excited to report that they leave throughout history a long track of their experiences. They tell us it cannot be described in words, but so overwhelming is the desire to describe it that it goes down in books. And it is given us so that in our darker moments we can look into the book and know that someone else stood where we stood, and that they went on, and that they had words of comfort to tell us about that crisis. We face what was faced by our ancestors and by their ancestors. It's a wonderful cartoon that showed two cavemen. One, very worried, said to the other, "Do you realize there are enough rocks in the world to kill every human being?" Now, which way do we turn? We have a desire to learn about ourselves. We certainly agree that there are problems in the world today. How do we deal with them? What do we do? Well, the first step is we decide, do we change others or do we change ourselves? Now, normally the first idea is we'll change others. It's much more attractive and it's really more interesting and more fun too. But in the end, we discover that it must be in changing ourselves that we can change others. When we speak of the responsibility of this minority, what do we speak of? When we speak of the responsibility of a spiritual human being, do we mean that this spiritual human being must go out and must push books into their friends' hands and must berate them about what they're doing wrong and must desperately attempt to provide an example? No. We mean that they quietly present an example. We mean that they go about living their lives according to their principles, and they are patient, and they realize that very often, in things that they never realized, they are teaching others, that a word spoken to another human being is passed on to another, and there it has impact, and we never know that that word was spoken through us. We live according to principle. We make our own search for truth. We learn to differentiate the inner voices and to live by the ones that provide us with a sense of peace, a sense of contentment, and a sense of rightness. And by doing so, our life becomes an example. And by doing so, we happen to arrive in situations where good can be done, and we are capable of doing that good. Sometimes it becomes very frustrating. One wonders, I've been being an example now for 10 years, and no one seems to have been exemplified. And it is a good point. Very seldomly do we have the satisfaction of seeing someone bloom like a flower underneath the beautiful sunshine of us. But we should be aware that irregardless of that the example is there, and that we are indeed doing good, simply by being who we are, simply that perhaps we don't do something that we might otherwise have done, and in not doing that, some real good is done. Perhaps, again, a word is spoken and overheard, and that word has impact. That in itself is enough. It can often be enough that the simple look of such a person, the feeling of their presence, provides a sense of comfort that is key to an individual's having the resolve to do something that they were afraid to do. And that action may have real impact. We are all so vitally interconnected. We all have so much in common with each other, and so many tremendous avenues of communication and of constant influence, that it is really beyond us to be aware of just how we are affecting others. And it isn't important that we know. In fact, better that we do not know, because when we begin to try to affect others, then we're in trouble. We're back to our old phrase, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the Tao. But by being ourselves and by being committed and searching and working on our integral principles, we do some good. We do teach by example. We turn ourselves. And in turning ourselves, we provide another avenue of expression. We provide another example. We provide another atom of peace in our chaotic molecule of the earth. That is enough. A bit of stillness is enough, particularly in so noisy and chaotic a period. Many who enter the spiritual path have grand conceptions. Most of us go through the Savior stage. Many of us have desires to be able to reach vast numbers of individuals and bring great light to their lives, and indeed, it is a very, very commendable desire. However, what we soon realize, and what we must realize, is that these activities are not so much developed as bestowed, that it is for us to work the soil, and what will be grown out of it, the seeds of that are already present. And exactly how they will grow is dependent not so much on how we cultivate the soil, but on what is in the soil and how the sun shines, and what kind of water and how much water is given to the growing plant. And this is not in our control. And this, in the end, has perhaps more importance to the final result than the seed itself had. When one looks at an oak, one does not simply see an acorn. One sees the soil, the minerals, the sun, the air, the water that all went into building that oak. And so with each of us, the spiritual edifice, if you like, although it's too static a word, is built out of all of these influences, natural influences, human influences, spiritual influences. And we begin to see here the tremendous responsibility that we have and the tremendous feeling of oneness with other human beings that we should have. There is much talk these days of the sense of isolation, and it is certainly wrapped up in the idea of materialism and in the idea of apathy. But what is this isolation, this idea that we have no real communion with other individuals? If an effort is made to look into some of these old books and to suddenly discover that someone who lived 2,000 years ago had precisely the same thought that you're having, irregardless of where they were, in a different language, but had the same thought, faced the same doubt, knew the same fear, perhaps found the same answer, or at least offers a functional answer, it is a surprise. And it should also be a cure of this sense of isolation. Because it is not that this one individual who lived 2,000 years ago was somehow peculiarly like you. Within every person you see lurks that individual. Within every person you speak to lurks that individual. And lurks yourself, your own experiences, the things that you face. Those of you who have spent time in study may also know this experience. Finding some transcendent truth, walking out into the street and hearing someone at a bus stop say it. In some ways, it's very humbling, but in other ways, it's dazzling that another person arrived in their own way at that same truth. That another person shared a course of development similar to yours, so much similar that these deep internal feelings can be spoken of with understanding. Language is a very limited thing. It is the great passion of modern philosophy to nitpick at language. And it is interesting to a certain extent. It should not be disparaged. It is interesting to note how limited language is, but it is more interesting to note that despite the limitations, it works to provide us with comfort and understanding and to show us the common similarity between human beings. That an individual can stand before the same landscape, 1,000 years of time between yourself, and have the same feelings, not the same thoughts, same feelings, same awe, same wonder, the same sense of questions. Consider that the great questions that face humanity about God and being and purpose have not been answered to anyone's satisfaction, and have been the common questions of every race and culture known to our history. There have always been those searching for those answers, and we have reports of those who found the answers. And we have the suspicion that the answers were so terrifyingly simple that we ignore them. Dharma and Dharma. Everything we see, everything we think about, provides us with answers. Everything we see is an embodiment of a truth. One of the individuals in our American heritage who is particularly ignored and who I want to focus on, because it seems that this person presented a uniquely balanced approach, a balance that may be most suitable to many of us. It was a man named John Muir, of whom most of you have heard. Now, I've heard some wonderful things about who John Muir was when I brought up the name. Well, he was that guy who ran around the mountains and that sort of thing. Very few people are aware of who John Muir really was. John Muir was a very eloquent, very spiritual man who left us two testaments. The first, his own writings, which are really beautiful and filled with spiritual insight and comfort. And maybe more importantly, John Muir left us with one of the greatest gospels that any teacher has ever left. He left us with Yosemite. By his efforts, he made Yosemite into a park that is now available for us to go and enjoy. And he left us other such parks. Here is a gospel that the deaf, the blind, can feel. And if there be any doubt of that, I would like to quote to you something. I won't tell you who said it until I've said it, so that the impact will be that much more dramatic. It was said that if one can enjoy the sun and flowers and music, where there is only silence and darkness, then one has proven the mystic sense. And that was said by Helen Keller, who should know. So we have this tremendous gospel, Yosemite. We have a place where the illiterate can go, the impatient can go, and can literally be healed, can look at the beauty, can take in the natural rhythms, and can have this experience of what life is supposed to be like. Now, how often do these people return to the city and have an outbreak of rage and frustration and anger, the noise, the smog? Well, there's a lesson in that also. It's not to say that one should run off to Yosemite and drop everything unless that is what one truly feels. But it is that one should always have this measure. One should always be aware of what can be as well as what is. Part of this tremendous apathy, part of this frustration, is unquestionably this feeling of the urban monster all around us, the noise, the smells, the constant distraction. To go off into the woods, or to go off into a desert or by an ocean, to stand, is to restore a sense of refreshment, a sense of this is what it means to be alive. And it brings greater understanding also when we go back to read those teachers who also enjoyed these kinds of natural wonders. Notice that the greatest teachers are silent or didn't write, or in the sense of a Zen Roshi, when you walk up to them and ask some great deep question, slap you one. So you realize, don't use this, use this. See clearly with the heart. Now this book, The Atheist Handbook, trumpets its greatest argument in the idea of evil in the world. If there is a good God, how can there be evil in the world? And we've had discussions about this all through history. Thomas Aquinas wasted many trees trying to prove that there was a reason for a good God to have evil in the world. There have been many, many arguments about this. And we could sit and discuss between us all sorts of wonderful rationalizations about the relativity of evil, about evil as the projection of ignorance. They really don't mean very much, because when one leaves Yosemite Park or an auditorium or one's house and goes out into the city and has a nasty experience. Oh, it hurts. And we wonder, how can people be that way? Well, think back. Think back to the difference and think that perhaps this individual has not been out of their frame of consciousness for a very long time. Perhaps this individual is truly suffering, and in their expression of hatred or of frustration is showing pain. And it is unnecessary to rationalize about what that means or why it's allowed to happen. The point remains that here is a living being in pain and expressing this pain. In most every religion, the concept of healing has entered, whether it be mental, emotional, or physical healing. But the idea of therapy and of healing has been a continuous factor. But what is the healing of? We're usually so much concerned with the disease of the physical body that we forget that there is another kind of pain, perhaps a more terrifying pain, a pain that may cause the physical disease. And this is a pain of anguish, of a spirit, of a soul, of a mind, of emotions that are detached from what life can be, that are detached from beauty and the sense of awe. And it takes so little to remind oneself of it. It only takes a short trip. It only takes the sight of an ocean wave, a moment of quiet. Whatever best serves you to rediscover that stillness, the stillness that is within all the motion and beauty and color of the world. To restore that sense of stillness is to have health, and is to be an example, and is to best serve, because only then does one become a true instrument of service, a true example, a truly peaceful human being. Now, where do we stand? Here we face, each of us in our different situations in life, each of us of different ages. Where do we stand in this, our culture, in America, looking at the world situation? What can we do? We can contact the sense of stillness. We can do the most that we can do, whatever that be, whether it be an individual who spends 14 hours of ruthless study attempting to decipher some obscure language to find a truth he is certain is there, or whether it be an individual who spends a few moments a day in peace, holding a good thought, imagining the entire world as an expression of goodness, and rather than saying, there is evil here, and I see the evil here, and I cannot accept that this is a world of goodness, saying, well, I will take it on trust that I am not omniscient, and it may be that I'm not actually seeing what good there is in here. It has been said that evil is banality, that evil is ultimate dullness, ultimate limitation, numbness. That is when people are so adrift in the torpidity of the body that they are then able to do things which we call evil. They are so unconscious that they are able to act without understanding of their actions. If this is true, then it becomes a question for each of us how to develop the most consciousness that we can. Very often we walk away from a situation and say, why didn't I say that? What we're actually saying is that we weren't conscious enough at that moment, that we weren't truly aware of the situation. And if we project that picture onto the whole of the world today, of this planet, we have a perfect answer to these terrible situations we face. We are insufficiently conscious. We're not aware of what's happening. Too few of us have taken the time to examine internally. Too few of us have made the effort to discover what we are. We become so worried, so bogged down in the international situation, in economic problems that we absolutely forget that we don't even know what it is that's bogged down in the economic problems. We wonder about how we can achieve our goals and forget that we don't even know what it actually is that has these goals. We're not even sure where the goals came from. The greatest mystery that faces us is not one of these externals. It's not death. It's not how to live a good life. The greatest mystery is, what are we? What is a human being? And can that question be answered? And so we see a long line of advice that can be put into two words: know thyself. And attached to that is every imaginable philosophic and religious doctrine. The idea being, if you know yourself, you will be this way. If you know yourself, you will be humble. If you know yourself, you will do what you should do. You will fit into the world. The Transcendentalists in New England were very fond of talking about how each person was produced by nature for a reason. That every person was here, that nature never wastes, that every person was here to do something that only they could do. Only they would have the talent and the orientation to accomplish that task. Well, the big mystery then becomes, well, what is it? We're very curious creatures, and we want to know in advance what it is so that we can be sure to wreck our chances of doing it well. Well, the only way to know, if there is any way to know, is to open ourselves to become as fully conscious as we can. To envision that this world does function as a plan. I don't even care how one envisions it. Is it a school? Is this a place where derelict souls come to learn? Or is this a great testing ground? It's irrelevant. But to envision that there is such a purpose, and to have faith that there is an essential goodness, and that what you see in the world is a reflection, a projection of how you see yourself. The bitter materialist is always amazed that the dewy-eyed optimist sees nothing but flowers everywhere, and what a magnificent world it really is. And the optimist cannot understand how come the materialist sees nothing but death and decay. They project themselves. One is not true and the other false. There is no truth or falsehood here. They project themselves. And if the materialist is happy in seeing his world of death and decay, then he must be left to see it. But if we are not happy in seeing a world of death and decay, we do not have God or other human beings to blame. We do not have natural order to blame. We do not have the excuse of saying, well, we're merely a fungus that developed on this planet. What we actually have is ourselves to blame. We have ourselves to rework. In the symbolism of alchemy, each of us becomes the alchemical crucible in which the great work is done. The transmutation is a transmutation of our emotions, of our thoughts, of our very perceptions, of our way of seeing the world. The way we see the world changes. And perhaps it takes two optimists or two idealists to truly understand each other. Perhaps there can be almost no communication between an idealist and a materialist. Perhaps there can only be communication in those areas where one touches the other. And those become the bridges. And one would be surprised how often those bridges are not written down or spoken, but are, again, bridges of example, are bridges of conduct, are the key question. After 10 long years of philosophical argument, why am I miserable and you are happy? Well, now I can tell you if you're really interested. They may not listen to you, but they may ask again and again, and yet another time. And each time, there's an opening. The very question is progress. It's all that one can really ask. It's all that one really should be concerned with doing, is being available to provide. such an example and such comfort. There is much talk these days of the New Age. I will tell you this about the New Age. It will come to be because human beings care enough that it should happen. It will not come to be because we sit and wait for it. It will not come to be because we fervently pray that it should happen and then go out to our businesses or to our schools or out into the street and wreak havoc. It will happen because we care enough to create a new age within ourselves. That is where the New Age actually begins. For it to extend to the rest of humanity is a concern that we should not be involved with. This is outside of our context of necessity. This is the business of the race as a whole. And it may be worthwhile for each of us to consider ourselves as representatives of that. To look around at the world and to be frustrated and to say, there is no progress. I work, but no one else works. I believe, but no one else believes. I speak, no one listens. Work on oneself. Work on yourself. Read that. Read that Dharma. Understand what it says about you. Perhaps it says that you need support. Perhaps it says that you are insecure and that you wish to have someone else say to you, yes, I believe this. And that's why you're angry. Perhaps it says that you don't really believe what you pretend to believe. That it isn't enough that you hold the belief. That if you can't convert the rest of humanity, the belief must somehow be wrong. Distrust system. System, the laying down of how it should be done in the interest of converting humanity. Distrust it. Remember, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the eternal Tao. The system is fine to refer to be conditioned, to be worked with, to be experimented with, to reach one's own understandings within that system. And even if one should find that a system perfectly accords with belief and experience, it does not mean that the system accords with everyone's belief and experience. We have a myriad of approaches. We have all sorts of religions and philosophies and aphorisms and paintings, anything you like. But it doesn't mean that one must work for every human being. There is a sufficiency for all of us. And perhaps the greatest problem is that there isn't enough effort to find the right one. Friends who may not be involved in these kind of efforts are very quick to say, it doesn't work. Perhaps they experiment for a month or 2 months or a year. They say, it doesn't work. I thought it would work, and I did it, and no one gave me a present. Or someone took my house. How can it be working? And the whole thing collapses. Think for a moment. Has this person exhausted every possibility? Let's not even examine the fallacious reason they're using. But have they searched through every religion and philosophy? Have they looked all over the world? Have they sold everything and gone searching to see if it really doesn't work? Every individual who has done that comes back and reports, it works. And I'll do my best to convince you to do what I did, so you can see that it works. Every one of these individuals comes back and says, it's out there, it's all true. Everyone looks back at the history of the others who went out there and says, what they said was all true. They become brothers over centuries, and there's a feeling of intimacy between them, unlike any intimacy between individuals who do not agree. John Muir was a man who spent a great amount of time in the wilds and accomplished tremendous things there in the sense of physical vigor. I highly recommend a small volume called Stikine, a story about Muir and a glacier and a dog that can be read in an hour. I recommend it because it is a lesson in what the human being can accomplish. The kind of rigor and vigor of which the human body is capable. But what is underneath the rigor and vigor? Is it that this individual was so physically strong that he was able to accomplish what he did? One notices very quickly the individual's attitude. That Muir looked at a problem which any one of us would probably foresee as certain death, and rather than being cowed by it, found a simple answer, was very optimistic, hiked 7 miles in the snow in the darkness to see if the answer would work, and if it didn't, hiked back and enjoyed the process, didn't worry about it. Muir was actually a rather small man, and his physical accomplishments must stand as testaments to his accomplishments of soul and of spirit. When one reads his journals, one is amazed at the spiritual presence shining through his observations of nature and of people. He discusses the feeling of walking on living rock as imparting electric shocks on the foot as compared to walking on dead planks. He talks about the amazing rebirth of a morning waking in the forest. He talks about looking at a campfire and seeing the creation of the universe in the sparks. One of the things which he teaches, and perhaps the only thing that could be taken as spiritual advice from this man, was feed the soul and feed the body. Develop them both. Nourish them both. Strengthen them both. Now, he felt the best place to do it was the mountains. But why did he feel that one should nourish both? In opposition, one might add, to many schools of Asian thought and of many schools of later Platonism, where the body was supposed to be very much put under, was supposed to be controlled and starved. Why did Muir feel something so different? He reported that when he was truly tired, when his body was built into full vigor, and he tired it out, and he laid down, then he knew that the soul and the body were not one, because the soul went and soared while the body slept. And when the soul returned, the limbs were difficult to move. They were heavy. Also, when he developed his body to full vigor, he found there was an intelligence in the body that was lacking in the mind. That he would look at a challenge, at a rock that was very steep, and his mind would tell him it's impossible to climb that. And as he was saying it was impossible, the body moved him forward and up the rock. The body knew that it was possible. And again, it said to him, there is a difference between the body and the soul. Now, Muir left us a practical legacy. Muir was not an ascetic who ran about the woods and left us a message. He did a little bit more. He felt so strongly about this that he fought politically to save for us as much of the beauty of the wilderness as he could. And he had defeats. Near the end of his life, he tried to save the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which was made into a reservoir, and which he said was even more beautiful than Yosemite. And it was a terrible blow to him. Yet he accepted it. And as he lay on his deathbed, he worked on a book, on his final book. He was active to the very end. I submit that he presents a uniquely American kind of sage. A physical sage, a spiritual sage. A sage who took what the country had to offer, not only in its beauty naturally, but in its beauty of human resource. A sage who spoke to Emerson in the Yosemite Valley, looked on him and said, "You are a sequoia. Stay and meet your older brethren." A sage who did not feel anger at those who defeated his plans for saving parklands because they wished to make money. Rather, one who felt pity and who felt sorrow that he had not been able to make them see what he saw, that he had somehow failed, that if any human being could be made to see it, could be provided with the proper circumstances to enjoy it, they could never make such a decision. And that obviously somehow in his writings and his actions, he had failed to make them see that. And yet he did leave quite a lot for us to enjoy. And perhaps what he did leave most importantly was this image of what we can represent as Americans. We were incarnated here for a reason. We're in America for a purpose. If we were to go study in Tibet, why not have been born in Tibet? We were not born into a desert here. We were born into a rich, a spiritually and naturally rich country. We simply need look around, pick out a few things that particularly appeal to us, with which we can go forward. We simply need to look around and to understand that there is an essence of newness and of wonder here that could with great effect be transmitted to the rest of the world. There was a time not so long ago when America was the young giant, and the world stood smiling before its vigor, surprised at what it was able to accomplish. The young giant is now in its adolescence and is having great difficulties adjusting. But adjust it will. And it will adjust just as the human adolescent adjusts, by discipline, by increase of awareness. It will adjust by learning and by making mistakes. Now, there are two kinds of mistakes that we all face, our own and the mistakes of our nation. Let us first worry about the mistakes that we make. Let us first look to those and correct those. Because in correcting them, we are correcting national mistakes. Just before World War II, there was a great style in historical literature. And it's perhaps best typified by Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, which was actually the ruin of the West in German. Scholars gleefully describe the destruction of Western culture. We were either going to be inundated by Eastern philosophy and thought and become Orientalized, or we were simply going to destroy ourselves in some great cataclysm. They really enjoy talking about it. It's amazing to read with what vigor they write about these things. However, note who reports it. Here is a case of judging the fruit by the tree. Note that we are dealing with individuals who are not interested in practice, who are theorists. Here we are talking about individuals who are grossly limited in their experiences, who because of certain psychological predispositions ignore alternatives, or at best give them cursory attention, slash them to bits with logic, and then leave them, and actually accomplish nothing in the doing. It is sometimes sad and sometimes amusing to read with what sense of triumph these doctrines are obliterated by logical minds. But what is actually recorded there is something sad, is an individual so frightened by these greater truths that they are desperately seeking to neutralize them and are using this part of themselves, one small part, to neutralize all the rest, are living in the mind. It is very useful to look at the theories that are often used against the idea of God or spirit or of better purpose or of goodness. We turn to psychoanalysis. We turn to Freud and we say, Freud didn't believe there was a soul. Or we turn to some scientists. We would be surprised how many scientists did if we really sat down and studied it. We would be surprised to find that Albert Einstein once wrote, imagination is far more important than knowledge. We'd be surprised how close, and this is now almost a cliche, they are to mystics, the truly great scientists. But we turn to the less great and we say they don't believe there's a soul. They don't believe that there's God. But we don't take the time to look at who says it, to say to ourselves, is this an individual who has actually gone and practiced, who has studied, who has really searched, who has sought out the answers? We don't take the time to realize that we are listening to an authority on one subject speak about another. Just as if one might go and speak to an authority on coins about stamps. There really is no essential correspondence between the two fields. We must learn to look. Again, the question of awareness. We must learn that when we do such things, more likely than not, it is not that we are moved by the powerful argument of this individual, that here, this Freud has convinced us and we now drop our belief. Rather, that the belief which we have is such that Freud was able to disturb it. It does not mean that the truth has changed. It means only that we are working on a level similar to Freud's. And if we have no answer to Freud, and we simply say, I believe what I believe, and the materialist guffaws in triumph that he has defeated us because we have no answer, the silence in itself is the answer. Silence is the most eloquent testament. Silence is the true purveyor of stillness. And sometimes it is best that we be silent. Sometimes it is best that we stand in awe before what has been given us, that we don't even consider it, that we stand in awe, we enjoy the stillness, and then we translate that to find the stillness within each of us. There is a new age. There is transformation. There is the alchemical stone. There is the great mystery that solves every question. Thank you.